In Sitka, Alaska, a native people offered their last major resistance to the coming of the white man. The outcome affected the course of history in Alaska and the whole North Pacific. Centuries ago, the shallow bed of Bering Strait stood above water. Migrating peoples crossed this natural bridge between continents, and over many decades, they moved southward through the broad Yukon Valley. Finally, according to legend, they followed the salmon streams to the coast near the Nass River in British Columbia. From there, forebears of the Tlingit Indians eventually moved northward into southeastern Alaska. The story of Sitka, one of the Tlingit villages, began with the Kiksadi clan of the Tlingit, the people of Kix Bay, a name they took as they migrated northward. As they moved up the coast, the Kiksadi towed behind their canoes the symbol of their family, a carved frog, and sang a song saying, "We have started towing the frog with the breeze from Nass River. I wonder where it will settle." It settled in Sitka. This wooded site on a large sound was ideal for the Kiksadis. Much of their food came from the sea and tide flats, and from the berries and game found in the woods. Summer was spent preparing for the long leisure of winter, when they would turn to culture and crafts, for which they became well known. The people on the northwest coast had one of the most distinctive cultures in America. They were best known for their totem poles, found in many villages. Carved house fronts also were numerous and served to identify the clans or families living in these massive wood structures. Inside the house, family emblems often decorated the four main posts and the screen before the section where the chief lived. Warriors went into battle in body armor of hide or wood slats, heavy face masks, and thick wooden helmets. The Tlingit made elaborate clothing for special occasions. For ceremonies, they made special hats showing the emblems of the owner's family. And they created the Chilkat blanket, a classic in Northwest Coast art. When Europeans first reached southeastern Alaska, they described the silent, heavily wooded shores as ominously forbidding. The picture grew darker when they met the aggressive Tlingit, whose strong sense of property rights had led many times to rivalry and war. The first clues to Alaska's wealth were carried to the outside world when the Russian survivors of the 1741 voyage of Vitus Bering returned from the newly discovered land with rich furs. Ships of several nations visited the long, uncharted coast. The Boston men, as the Yankees were called, came in increasing numbers after the American Revolution. But the British and the Russians were the principal rivals for control of this territory. The British pushed their fur trade westward and northward as the Russians moved south. To establish their control of Alaskan waters, Russian traders built posts along the coast. The first permanent settlement was on Kodiak Island in 1784. By 1798, the Russian fur trade was on the decline. The sea otter was fast disappearing, and competition among fur traders was heavy. Alexander Baranov, the manager of the Russian-American Company, decided to locate a permanent settlement at a point of strategic control and in a more productive hunting area on the straits and sounds adjoining the mainland. He chose Sitka. In 1799, when Baranov arrived on the shores of Sitka, the Kiksadi gathered, and after a long council, an agreement was reached. On a plot of ground known today as Old Sitka, the Russians built a fort, a stake planted in the heart of Tlingit country. The Russians were harsh and arrogant to the natives, tempers shortened, but Baranov did not feel the fort was in danger. The Russians Russians felt secure even when the Tlingit began buying arms from British and American traders. Suddenly, in 1802, the Tlingit had had enough. They attacked and destroyed the Russian fort. Only a few Russians escaped. Determined to re-establish this post, Baranov returned to Sitka in 1804 with the gunboat Neva, 300 baidarkas and over 1,000 men. The Tlingit, expecting the Russians to return, had already built a fort at a strategic point at the mouth of Indian River, although continuing to live in their ancestral homes on Castle Hill. In the face of the Russian strength, they reluctantly left Castle Hill and moved into the Indian River fort. On October 1st, 1804, the Russians anchored within cannon range of the fort. The firing began, but the Russians got little response and saw little effect on the fort walls. This apparent lack of resistance encouraged the Russians to send a landing party ashore. Inside the fort, a warrior named Katlyan put on the Quixote's raven hat and, armed with only a blacksmith's hammer, prepared to lead the Quixote defense. He left the fort and floated unobserved behind a log down Indian River to prepare an attack from the rear. When the Russian party neared the fort, a sudden barrage of gunfire rang out behind the walls. As if by signal, Katlyan leaped to the attack. His appearance amid the invaders, wildly shrieking the cry of a raven and swinging his hammer with painful accuracy, forced the Russians to retreat to their vessels. Several days of inconclusive bombardments and parleys followed. The Russians demanded immediate surrender, and the Tlingit, determined to resist, stalled for time, hoping for supplies of ammunition from another village. As hope faded, they began to pack for an evacuation. On the morning of the 7th day, an eerie silence hung over the fort. A Russian party went ashore, but the Tlingit were gone. Their departure marked the start of many years of constant vigilance by the Russians. It was a hollow victory indeed, when a Russian was not safe outside his own stockade. However, Russian thoughts turned quickly to settling in before winter. They burned the fort on Indian River and replaced the Quixote houses on Castle Hill with a house for Baranov. By spring, the Russians had 8 substantial buildings finished, 2 ships under construction, ground cleared for 15 vegetable gardens, and an accumulation of livestock. They built a stockade for protection, even though there was a token peace. The Tlingit distrusted the Russians, and it was many years before they returned to Sitka. Finally, after more than 20 years, the Tlingits rebuilt their homes at Sitka next to the Russian fort. But the Russian guard never relaxed, although it was easier to protect the city with the Tlingit just outside the wall, where they could be watched. For many years, the Tlingits provided meat and game to Sitka. The city gates were open for trade only during certain hours, and the Tlingit left promptly at curfew. While Chicago was still a small fort on the banks of a lazy river, and San Francisco only a sleepy Mexican village, Sitka was the capital of Russian America, a city where churches, a museum, schools, clubs, and industries thrived for more than half a century.